So why is content strategy important? According to Christina Halverson, who runs an organisation called Brain Traffic, who specialise in content strategy in the US, content strategy is a necessary practice in any organisation that creates and publishes content online. Essentially, the reason for that is because the quality of the content you produce has a direct effect on the success of your website. Poor content can equate to confused and unhappy users. And at the end of the day, your website's only as good as the content that's on it. It could look fantastic, but if the content doesn't do the job it needs to do, then people won't use it. Well-structured content means that your users can efficiently transact with you via your website. That makes customers happy. It means they'll come back and use the website again, and hopefully it will become their channel of choice when they transact with you. But also, as we've seen from the examples Tony's talked about, it can lead to quite significant financial savings for you if you enable that process. Normally, what you find is that confused online customer experiences are caused by a number of things that are all really interrelated. It's either out-of-date content, people haven't had the time or the inclination to go in and make sure content's kept up to date on the site. Things like calls to action are poorly signposted. So, maybe the key link on the page is buried somewhere in the text, and it's quite hard for someone when they're browsing that page to easily notice that and follow that transaction through. Pages get cluttered with too much unnecessary detail. So, you go to a page on a council website because you want to report that your bin's been stolen, and you're presented with a lot of facts and figures about how much it costs the council to replace bins each year and all this kind of stuff. And then finally you get to the bit that says, oh, did you want to report that your bin was missing? Incomprehensible jargon. You end up with, some fantastic phrases I've seen on local authority websites that, to everyday users are probably completely meaningless. And the other thing is duplication of content. You end up with the same piece of content in several different places on the site, and that becomes very confusing for the user because actually they're not really sure, is it the same content? Is it something different? Which bit is actually the important bit that I need to read? And it can also, duplication of content can have a significant effect on things like Google search rankings. Google hates duplicated content. More often than not, all of these things are caused by sort of one or more of three root causes. There's either a lack of investment in quality, an inconsistency in the way that content's presented and written. So it's very obvious when someone goes to your website that the content's been written by 100 different people. It doesn't have that single kind of voice that the organisation should have. And also the failure to review and optimize content to make sure it's up to date, to make sure it's doing the job that it needs to do. What a well-adopted content strategy will help you to do is mitigate against all of those issues. Content strategy is there so you can focus on the way that you manage your content, the way that you structure your content, and essentially needs to be structured around your users' needs. So understanding what it is that your users do on your site, and how you actually can then go about meeting those requirements. And as we said, and repeat again and again, it's all about content. When you take away branding, sort of design style choices, animations, tools, delivery methods, it's all about content. That's what you end up with. That's the product of your website, essentially. So actually, what is content strategy? This is a neat little diagram that kind of explains it. Content strategy really is a strategy that should cover two key elements of the way that you look at content as an organisation. There's what we call content components, which are traditionally things like style guides. How do you structure your content? How do you write it? what is appropriate for writing and presenting on the website. And then on the other side of the coin, there's what we call people components, which is more about how do you govern the content and the way that users are producing the content for your site. How do you ensure that you have nice workflows that ensure that the content that ends up being published meets the content component requirements for your site, so you end up with that perfect user experience that you're looking for. You tend to find that a lot of people produce style guides and think that's their content strategy. That's just one tiny bit of the content strategy. The benefits of having a clear, documented, adopted content strategy are that essentially it will provide structure and guidance for people authoring content within the organisation. They'll know how they should write their content, what content is appropriate, how it should be positioned on the website to make all those things like calls to action clear, and to create effective user journeys. Essentially it plans for the creation, publication and governance of useful, usable content. I think this is a great quote because the key word I think in here is usable. You can have lots and lots of useful content, but if you don't present it in a usable way, then it doesn't fulfill the brief really. So your content strategy gives you a way of ensuring that your useful content is written and presented in a usable manner. And by doing that, it also builds trust in your content through consistency. So you don't end up with that website that looks like it's been written by 100 different people. You have a clear, consistent voice as an organisation that people can then trust. One of the key things that's already been talked about this morning is, good, well-structured content can reduce contact through other channels that you might want to avoid. And through that, you can significantly reduce costs and increase savings. These were just some figures I came across that have been gathered to do with the cost of actually booking a driving test online. Worked out that if someone booked a driving test by post, it was £6.62 to actually process that transaction, £4.11 by telephone, but if someone did it online, it cost 22 pence. So quite a significant saving if that process is followed online. I think they did have some figures around face-to-face contact as well. I think it came out at over £9 to actually process a transaction face-to-face. So by shifting people towards the website through having good, clear, well-structured content, you can incur those savings and make sure that you can invest that money elsewhere or on other projects. So the first stage in terms of thinking of building a content strategy is thinking about what the foundation should be for it. Determine your goals. What's the purpose of your website? What is it there for? Is it there as a marketing tool, or is it there to service customers? What ideally is your purpose, so you can define that, and then any content that doesn't meet that purpose doesn't end up on the website. Focus your content to work towards some kind of measurable goal. So within your strategy, you can define how users should look at a piece of content and determine what purpose it serves. How do you measure whether that piece of content is successful? Essentially, if there's no goal for a piece of content, to all intents and purposes, it doesn't have a purpose to be there. And that equates to essentially wasted time for you in terms of managing that content, but also wasted time for the user who's having to wade through that information before they actually get to what they want to use. Focus on what the needs of your audience are. Why do people come to your website? What is it that they want to do? Do they just want to come there to find out about your organisations and products that you offer, or do they come there for very specific purposes because you're the only people they can come to for certain transactions? You know, focus on what the customer wants to know and not what you want to tell them. Too often, websites really focus on sort of what the organisation wants to communicate, as opposed to thinking about what it is that the customer's looking for. Decide on the voice and tone that you want to use on your website, and document that as part of your content strategy. A lot of people think voice and tone are the same thing, but they're not really. This is quite a useful sort of definition of what the difference is between voice and tone. This is written by a lady called Kate Kiefer-Lee, who's content strategist for MailChimp. And she kind of equates voice and tone in terms of writing to the way that you use your voice and tone as a human being. You know, your voice in general stays pretty much the same. The way you sound doesn't change, but what you do is you adjust your tone based on the situation and what it is that you're communicating. And you should take that kind of approach to your content as well, because it helps you position your content then in terms of the customer's frame of mind when they come to, you know, your website and they have a specific transaction in mind that they want to complete. You know, someone who's going online to check their council tax balance will probably have a totally different frame of mind to someone who's going online because they want to report their neighbour for benefit fraud. So you can adjust the tone of what you're saying to match the sort of emotional context of that transaction. Yeah. And again, it's focusing on what the content is, focusing on, you know, what the words and pictures are, not what they look like. To a certain degree, with things like responsive design, concepts that traditionally people have thought about, like previewing your web page to see what it's going to look like before it's published, become slightly outdated. Rather than focusing on what the page is going to look like, focus on what you're actually saying. And the other thing is to think about looking at things like statistics to determine customer behaviour. It's not always useful to ask people, you know, what do they want to do on your website. There's this quote which is often attributed to Henry Ford, but no one's actually quite sure if he said it or not, where he said, if I'd asked people what they wanted, they'd have said faster horses. You know, what you should really do is, you know, use facts and not feelings when you're thinking about your content and how you position it and how you write it. You know, don't sort of think, well, actually, we think this is important. Actually, have the factual information to say, actually, we know this is important, and that's why we're going to make it the most prominent thing on our homepage. And you can gather that sort of information through a number of ways. We saw in the content game that we played earlier today that you know, quite often the statistical data doesn't always match what the customers say they're going to do. And so it's actually really useful to understand what people are doing on your site. And in certain contexts as well, not just how people are interacting with the site, looking at analytics across the board for all of your channels to determine, you know, what the most important transactions to us as an organisation that customers are interacting with, to help that inform the way that you structure content. There's a quote from Jerry McGovern that kind of backs this up. He has a very long story to go behind this quote, but essentially says that the worst way to design a website is to have 15 customers in a room drinking lattes. What people say they're going to do and what they actually do are very rarely the same thing. So, you know, have an idea about what customers want, but have that factual data to support it and understand whether that is actually what they're doing. But build that methodology into your content strategy so that people, you know, have a clear understanding that when they're thinking about whether they need to put something on the website, they can sort of have the data to back it up and to inform their decisions. Now, one of the most important things when you're developing a content strategy is to remember this is a strategy. It's something that needs to be adopted across your organisation if you want it to be successful. So ideally you need senior level support. It's actually, you know, vital that you have senior management support for your content strategy so that rather than it being a document that sits in a cupboard and gathers dust, it's something you can actually enforce. So when someone says, actually, I want my content to look like this, you can say, well, no, because it doesn't fit the way that our strategy determines the way that we produce our content. It's really important to remember that everybody will have an opinion on how they want to present their content. Without that level of support, it's very difficult to contain that. And you end up with a website that looks like it's been written by lots of different authors, that every page is structured differently, and you end up with a very confused user experience. Unfortunately, getting senior level support is normally the hardest part of the process. Trying to get that senior management buy-in across the organisation when everyone has their own opinion is very, very hard to do. But it is vital in order to ensure that the process works smoothly. Your content strategy needs to become part of the organisation's overall strategy, so that it becomes embedded within everything you do as an organisation. It's something that it's a living, breathing part of people's day-to-day work. When you're trying to talk to senior management about why content strategy is important, to try and get them to buy into it, you'll get questions like, why should I support content strategy? Why do we need one? Why is having good quality content on the website, of value to us as an organisation? How can you illustrate that there'll be a return on investment on that? And the answers to those questions will probably differ from organisation to organisation. It's not something that you can, I can give you a simple answer for, but it's something that you would need to address if you're writing and developing a strategy. Ideally, you need to get to the point at the end of the day where senior managers in the organisation feel as invested in the content strategy as you are, so that you have their backing and you can then enforce what you want to do with your content. The other thing to always make sure that you do with content strategies is write them down. Have some kind of clear, documented guidance around them. Predominantly in terms of things like style guides. So, part of your content strategy should be a style guide that you can present to your users who are writing your content. And that should tell them, how you define your voice and tone guidelines, so that, editors know exactly how they should write content. And those guides should be as simple as possible. No one wants a sort of 70-page style guide that they have to wade through. But something short with clear points in it that people can refer to. It's essential if you want some kind of consistency across the website, and particularly if you want to be able to enforce it. If your users don't understand what's expected of them, then it becomes very difficult to say, well, actually, no, you can't do it that way. One of the great things, though, is with the web, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's lots and lots of style guides that have been developed by other organisations that you can take a look at. However, you should always focus your strategy very specifically on your needs as an organisation. It is sort of one of the hard parts of content strategy, that actually it's very difficult to just take someone else's strategy and repurpose it. You really need to think about sort of your organisation and your demographics and your user needs and build your strategy around that. But look at other style guides and other strategies and take what's good from them as a way of helping inform those decisions that you make. There's a whole range available online. These are just a few examples. So there's voiceandtone.com that you can go to, which is actually MailChimp's content strategy and style guide. They developed it as a website to make it nice and easy for their internal users to go in and sort of view the style guide. And then they thought, well, we'll just publish it online for anyone. So you can go and take a look at that. There's the Government Digital Service Content Style Guide, which has quite a lot of useful content in it. It is a bit long, It's one of those that, you know, you do have to wade through it a bit, but there are some really useful bits that you can pull out of that, in terms of thinking about how you might write a style guide. And then more recently, there's the Local Gov Digital Content Guidelines specifically for local authorities, that's been put together, that is actually quite a nice, short, concise guide to sort of thinking about your content in quite a specific way if you're looking at customer transactions. So it's worth looking at these things and, you know, pulling out the bits that you think are relevant to your organisation and that can help, and using them to inform the way that you write your guides and your strategy. In order to enforce your strategy, and as something that should be documented in your strategy, is thinking about the way that you also want your content workflows to work. Content workflows, you know, essential so that you can make sure that the content that's being produced and published on the website meets what you've defined in terms of your strategy. You know, it's written in a way that is going to suit your users and encourage people to come back and use your website again and again. You know, help users trust your site so they come back, you know, and you encourage channel shift. Essentially, your workflow should define the whole process of managing your content, from people authoring the content and what's expected of them in terms of content structure, to sort of editing and updating content, you know, how often should content be reviewed, all that kind of stuff, through to the actual approval and publication processes. Having all of that documented means that, you know, you have very clear guidelines about the way the whole process works. So your workflow is really, as I say, it's one of those kind of people components of your strategy. Ideally, you need some kind of gatekeeper. Gatekeeper could be one person who's responsible for approving your content. It might be a group of people in a central team. It might be a number of users devolved across the organisation in different places. But you need those people to be able to look at your content and review it and check that everything that's published meets those clear standards that you've set out in your strategy. And if they don't, they're the people that have the authority to say, well, actually, no, that's not being published. Even when someone who sits much higher up the food chain to them says, well, no, that's the way I want it. They need to have that kind of power. So, you know, just keep repeating. It's about making your useful content usable. People who are responsible for approving your content and publishing it, they're the people that will make sure that that happens. And it's very important that those people understand how important their role is. You know, ideally they should have quite a clear focus on understanding content structure and also, you know, understanding the user need and customer services. So hopefully at some point you'll get to the point where you've got your content strategy, it's been adopted, people are working to it, you're getting a much better user experience on your website. But the process doesn't really stop there. A bit like your content strategy needs to be reviewed and optimized regularly. You know, continually iterate it to make sure that actually it still meets the requirements of the organisation and your users. Because over time those things will change. What's right for the organisation and your users today might not necessarily work in a year's time. So continue to review the way that people are interacting with your content and how your content is working for you as an organisation. You know, your content strategy needs to evolve to support changes. Those changes could be changes in technology. So, you know, as an example, more and more we're talking about mobile now, whereas maybe 12 months ago we weren't. So content strategy written 12 months ago might not have taken those kinds of channels into account. There may be changes in user behaviour. Maybe the local demographic changes, and you need to take that into account in terms of how people are interacting with your services. You know, and the development and use of other channels. You know, who knows? Now we're talking about the web and sort of online being the ultimate channel that's going to save you money and promote your services. But, you know, in 10 years' time, who knows what that might be. To help get you started, you should all have in the folders that you've been given today a copy of our brief guide to content strategy, which covers a lot of what I've talked about, and is really intended to give you a bit of a starter in terms of how you can start thinking about developing a content strategy and the kinds of things you need to consider. So hopefully that will be useful for you all. If you have any questions at all about it, then don't hesitate to contact me.